October 12, 1944. A cold rain fell on the Luftwaffe maintenance facility outside Berlin as Klaus Hoffmann wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag that was already more oil than cloth. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp engine sat on the workshop table like a mechanical heart torn from the chest of the American P-47 Thunderbolt that had crashed 3 days earlier near the facility's perimeter. For 48 hours, Klaus and his fellow mechanic Werner Steiger had been examining every component, every bearing, every precisely machined cylinder of this captured enemy engine. They had approached the task with the confident expectation that they would confirm what Nazi propaganda had told them for years, that American engineering was crude, rushed, and inferior to German precision. Instead, what they discovered in that dimly lit workshop would shatter everything they believed about Germany's chances of victory. Werner stood across the table, his weathered face illuminated by the single hanging lamp that cast long shadows across the disassembled engine components. He held a connecting rod in his hands, turning it slowly, his fingers tracing the machining marks with the practiced touch of a man who had worked with aircraft engines since before the war began. His silence spoke louder than any words could. Klaus knew that look. It was the same expression he had seen on his own face when he caught his reflection in the workshop window earlier that morning, a mixture of disbelief, dawning horror, and the terrible weight of understanding something you wish you could unknow. "Klaus," Werner finally said, his voice barely above a whisper despite the fact that they were alone in the workshop. In Nazi Germany, even walls had ears, and some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Have you ever seen tolerances this precise on a mass-produced engine? Look at this. He held up the connecting rod, gesturing to the bearing surface. This isn't hand-fitted. This came off an assembly line. They're making these by the thousands, and every single component is machined to specifications that we can barely achieve when we hand-build our best engines. Klaus nodded slowly, his throat tight. He had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it first, as if speaking the truth aloud would make it more real. He reached out and picked up one of the cylinder heads they had removed earlier, feeling its substantial weight. The cooling fins were perfectly uniform, the casting flawless. No bubbles, no imperfections, no signs of the material shortages that plagued German manufacturing. This engine had been built by a nation that had resources to spare, by factories that could afford to reject anything less than perfection. "Werner," Klaus said quietly, meeting his friend's eyes across the table, "if they can build engines like this in the quantities we know they're producing, then everything we've been told about this war is a lie." 3 days earlier, the air raid sirens had wailed across the facility just after dawn. Klaus and Werner had rushed from the mess hall to their assigned shelter, joining dozens of other mechanics and support staff as American bombers droned overhead. The anti-aircraft guns had opened up with their familiar rhythmic thunder, and somewhere high above the cloud layer, a dogfight had erupted between American fighters and the handful of German interceptors that had managed to scramble in time. The mechanics had listened to the distant rattle of machine gun fire, the whine of engines pushed to their limits, and then closer than any of them expected, the distinctive whistling scream of an aircraft in an uncontrolled dive. The impact had shaken the ground beneath their feet. When the all-clear sounded 20 minutes later, Klaus and Werner emerged to find a column of black smoke rising from a field less than half a kilometer from their workshop. Major Friedrich Kessler, their commanding officer, had immediately organized a recovery team. If the aircraft was salvageable, if there were components they could study or perhaps even use, it could provide valuable intelligence. More importantly, it would give the propaganda ministry another small victory to announce an enemy aircraft brought down by the valiant defenders of the Reich. Klaus remembered the walk across the muddy field toward the crash site, his boots sinking into earth that was already churned by artillery practice and years of war. The P-47 Thunderbolt had come down hard but relatively intact. The pilot had apparently tried to glide the damaged aircraft to a landing, managing to keep the nose up until the last moment. The cockpit was crushed, and they found the American pilot still strapped in his seat, killed on impact. He looked young, maybe 22 or 23, with sandy hair and a face that in death seemed almost peaceful. Someone had already removed his identification tags and personal effects. Werner had stood there for a long moment, looking at the dead American, and Klaus saw something flicker across his friend's face, not triumph, but a weary sadness that seemed out of place for a man whose nation was supposed to be winning this war. But the real discovery came when they examined the engine. Despite the crash, the massive radial engine had remained largely intact, torn free from its mounts but structurally sound. Major Kessler had ordered it transported back to their workshop immediately. "Strip it down," he had told Klaus and Werner. "I want to know everything about how it's built, what materials they're using, what we can learn from it." There had been something in the Major's voice, an urgency that went beyond simple curiosity. Klaus would understand why later, when they began their examination and started to comprehend what this engine represented. Now, 3 days later, that engine lay disassembled before them, and the truth it revealed was more devastating than any bomb the Americans could drop. The first thing that struck Klaus when they began the disassembly was the sheer abundance of material. The engine casing was thick, robust aluminum alloy without any of the thin spots or substitutions that had become common in German manufacturing. Werner had commented on it immediately, running his caliper along the cylinder walls and shaking his head in disbelief. "They're not saving weight here," he had muttered. "They're building this like they have all the aluminum in the world." Klaus had nodded, thinking of the increasingly desperate measures he had witnessed in recent months. Magnesium substitutes that cracked under stress, recycled metals that introduced impurities, components that were designed to be just barely adequate rather than excellent. As they worked deeper into the engine, each new discovery reinforced the same disturbing pattern. The bearings were perfect, not good, not adequate, but absolutely perfect. Klaus held one up to the light, examining the surface with a jeweler's loupe. The machining was so precise that he could barely detect any tool marks. In German factories, even their best engines showed some evidence of hand-fitting, of skilled craftsmen making adjustments to compensate for minor variations in mass production. This bearing showed no such adjustments because it needed none. It had come off an assembly line already perfect, which meant the Americans had machinery capable of maintaining tolerances that German industry could only achieve through careful handwork. Werner had moved on to examining the fuel injection system, and Klaus heard him let out a low whistle. "Klaus, come look at this." The fuel lines were seamless, the fittings precisely machined, and the injection nozzles were examples of miniature engineering that spoke of advanced metallurgy and manufacturing techniques. "Look at the threading on these fittings," Werner said, pointing with a small screwdriver. "Perfectly uniform. No burrs, no imperfections. These were made by automated machinery, probably hundreds per hour, and every single one is identical." He paused, setting down the component with careful reverence. "We have master craftsmen who couldn't produce work this consistent if they spent an entire day on a single piece." Klaus felt his chest tighten as the implications settled over him like a heavy blanket. They had been told repeatedly through official channels and propaganda broadcasts that American industry was quantity over quality, that the Americans compensated for inferior engineering with sheer numbers. But this engine told a different story. The Americans had both quantity and quality. They could mass-produce precision. They had resources so abundant that they didn't need to compromise. Machinery so advanced that they didn't need craftsmen to hand-fit components, and industrial capacity so vast that they could afford to build every engine as though it were a masterpiece. Werner met his eyes across the workbench. Neither man spoke, but they didn't need to. They were both thinking the same thing. If this was the standard for American aircraft engines, if every P-47, every B-17, every fighter and bomber rolling off American assembly lines was built to these specifications, then Germany was not just losing the war. Germany had already lost. Klaus walked to the corner of the workshop where 3 German engines sat in various states of repair. These were the machines he and Werner maintained daily, the power plants that kept the Luftwaffe flying. He looked at them now with new eyes, seeing not the impressive German engineering he had always taken pride in, but the compromises and shortages that had become so routine he had stopped noticing them. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine nearest to him had cylinder heads patched with inferior alloy because the proper materials were unavailable. The BMW 801 beside it was missing components that had been cannibalized to keep other aircraft flying. Even the newest Junkers Jumo 213, their most advanced engine, showed signs of rushed production and material substitutions. Werner joined him, and together they stood in silence, looking back and forth between the German engines and the American masterpiece on the center table. The contrast was devastating. "I rebuilt the fuel pump on that Daimler-Benz last week," Werner said quietly. "Twice. The replacement parts were so poorly made that the first set failed within 3 hours. The second set I had to hand-fit myself, filing and adjusting for over 6 hours to make it work." He gestured toward the P-47 engine. "Their fuel system components are interchangeable. Any part from any engine, no fitting required, no adjustments. Just bolt it in and it works." Klaus did some quick mental calculations, numbers that made his stomach churn. If the Americans could produce engines this sophisticated with such speed, and if their quality control meant almost no failures, then their effective output was exponentially higher than Germany's. A German factory might produce 100 engines per month, but if 20 of them had defects requiring rework, and if components weren't truly interchangeable, requiring skilled mechanics to spend hours making adjustments, then the real output was perhaps 60 or 70 functional engines. The Americans, with their precision manufacturing, might produce 150 engines per month, and if 145 of them were perfect from the factory floor, requiring no additional work, then their effective advantage wasn't just numerical, it was overwhelming. "How many aircraft do you think they're building?" Klaus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Werner was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the American engine. "More than we can shoot down," he finally said. "More than we can ever shoot down. Even if every German pilot was an ace, even if every anti-aircraft gun hit its target, they can replace their losses faster than we can inflict them." He turned to look at Klaus, and in his friend's eyes, Klaus saw the same terrible understanding that was growing in his own mind. "We're not fighting a war anymore, Klaus. We're just delaying the inevitable. Every sortie, every mission, every aircraft we repair and send back up, we're just adding more names to a list of men who will die before this is over." The workshop suddenly felt very cold despite the space heater in the corner. Night had fallen by the time they locked the workshop door. Klaus insisted they continue working late, though both men knew it wasn't dedication to duty that kept them there. It was the need to talk, to process what they had discovered, and to do so in a place where they could be reasonably certain no one was listening. Even so, Werner checked the windows twice, pulling the blackout curtains tighter, and Klaus turned on the radio in the corner, tuning it to a station playing Wagner loudly enough to mask their conversation, but not so loud as to draw attention. They sat on opposite sides of the workbench, the disassembled American engine between them like evidence in a trial. Klaus pulled out a bottle of schnapps he kept hidden behind a toolbox for occasions when the cold bit too deep or the stress became too much. He poured 2 small glasses, and they drank in silence, the harsh alcohol burning away some of the chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. "My brother," Werner finally said, his voice barely audible even in the empty workshop. "You remember my brother Hans?" Klaus nodded. Hans Steiger had been a teacher in Munich, a thoughtful man who had questioned the regime's policies a bit too openly. "The Eastern Front," Klaus said quietly, remembering. Werner took another drink, his hand shaking slightly. "They sent him there 2 years ago for defeatist talk. He wrote a letter to a friend saying that Germany couldn't sustain a war on 2 fronts, that the resources weren't there. Someone reported him. 3 weeks later, he was assigned to a penal battalion heading to Stalingrad." Werner's voice cracked. "We never heard from him again." The implication hung heavy between them. What they were thinking now, what the evidence of this engine proved beyond doubt, was far more dangerous than anything Hans Steiger had written in a private letter. This wasn't speculation or political opinion. This was technical analysis, mathematical certainty, and a conclusion that could get them both executed for undermining military morale. Klaus looked at the workshop door, suddenly aware of how thin it was, how easily their voices might carry. "We keep working," he said, though the words felt hollow. "We do our jobs, we maintain the aircraft, we don't talk about this with anyone else." Werner met his eyes. "And we pretend we don't know? We send pilots up in aircraft we've repaired, knowing that every day we keep them flying is another day closer to when the Americans arrive here, another day for more young men to die." Klaus had no answer to that. The moral weight of their knowledge pressed down on him like a physical force. They were good mechanics, loyal Germans who had served their country faithfully. But loyalty to what? To a regime that had lied to them about their chances of victory? To a war effort that was consuming lives with no possibility of success? Or to the young pilots they knew by name, who trusted them to keep their aircraft flying, who would die in machines that Klaus and Werner maintained with their own skilled hands? Klaus let his mind drift back to 1937, to a time when the future had seemed bright and full of possibility. He had been 28 years old then, working as a senior machinist at a precision tool factory in Stuttgart. The work had been satisfying in a way that only craftsmanship could be, the challenge of holding tolerances measured in thousandths of a millimeter, the pride of seeing a component emerge from the lathe exactly as designed, perfectly balanced and flawlessly finished. German engineering had been synonymous with quality throughout the world, and Klaus had been part of that tradition. His father had been a machinist, and his grandfather before that. It was more than a job, it was an identity. He remembered the day representatives from the Air Ministry had visited the factory, looking for skilled workers to train as aircraft mechanics for the expanding Luftwaffe. The pay was better, the work was described as vital to national defense, and there was an appeal to the idea of contributing to something larger than himself. Germany was rebuilding, reclaiming its place among the great nations after the humiliation of the Great War and the chaos of the years that followed. The new government promised order, prosperity, and restored pride. Klaus had believed in those promises. They had seemed reasonable at the time, even noble. The training had been rigorous and thorough. He learned the intricacies of aircraft engines, the delicate balance of power and reliability, the critical importance of maintenance in keeping pilots safe. His instructors were veterans of the Great War, men who spoke with reverence about German engineering superiority. They told stories of how a single German fighter had been worth 3 Allied aircraft, how German pilots had dominated the skies until overwhelming numbers had finally worn them down. The lesson was clear: German quality would always triumph over mere quantity. It was a comforting narrative, one that fit perfectly with everything Klaus had learned about his craft. By 1939, when the war began, Klaus was a senior mechanic at the facility outside Berlin. He had watched the Blitzkrieg newsreels with genuine pride, seeing the aircraft he helped maintain sweeping across Poland, then France, then the skies, over Britain. The early victories had seemed to confirm everything he believed. German engineering, German training, German discipline. These were the factors that mattered. The Messerschmitt fighters were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field. The tactics were innovative and devastating. Victory had seemed not just possible but inevitable. Werner had joined the facility in 1940, transferred from another base with excellent recommendations. They had become friends quickly, bonding over their shared dedication to their work and their pride in maintaining the highest standards. Together, they had kept dozens of aircraft flying through the early years of the war, taking satisfaction in knowing that their skill directly contributed to German success. They had never questioned whether those successes would continue. They had never imagined that one day they would stand in their workshop, looking at an enemy engine, and realize that everything they had believed was wrong. Werner's memories of the Blitzkrieg years were painted in vivid colors of triumph and confidence. He had arrived at the facility in the spring of 1940, just as German forces were sweeping through France with a speed that shocked the world. Every day brought news of new victories, and the Luftwaffe seemed invincible. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters that Werner and Klaus maintained were the finest aircraft in the world, or so they had been told. The pilots who flew them spoke with the casual arrogance of men who knew they held the advantage in every engagement. Klaus remembered those days too, remembered the easy camaraderie in the workshop, the sense that they were part of something historic. The aircraft they serviced would return from missions with fresh kill markings painted on their fuselages, and the pilots would regale them with stories of British Spitfires falling from the sky, of bombers torn apart before they could reach their targets. The mechanics took pride in their role, knowing that their meticulous work kept these warriors in the air. Every perfectly timed engine, every properly tensioned control cable, every flawlessly balanced propeller was a contribution to German victory. They had worked long hours then, but the exhaustion had been different. The satisfying tiredness of meaningful labor, rather than the desperate fatigue of fighting a losing battle. There had been plenty of spare parts, adequate materials, and time to do the job properly. Werner recalled how they could reject components that didn't meet specifications, send them back to the factory for replacement without worrying about whether replacements would actually arrive. Quality was paramount because quality was achievable. The supply lines were short, the factories were running efficiently, and Germany's industrial machine seemed capable of producing everything the war effort required. The Focke-Wulf 190 fighters had arrived in 1941, and Klaus and Werner had been among the first mechanics trained to maintain them. The new aircraft were powerful and rugged, with radial engines that could take tremendous punishment and keep running. The pilots loved them, and the mechanics took pride in learning their intricacies. These were the years when German engineering seemed to validate every claim the propaganda ministry made. Their aircraft were superior, their tactics were innovative, and their enemies appeared unable to match either German quality or German skill. But looking back now with the perspective that the American engine had given them, Klaus could see the signs they had missed, the gradual lengthening of supply delays. The first time they had been asked to make do with inferior materials, the occasional directive to cannibalize parts from damaged aircraft rather than wait for factory replacements. These changes had come slowly, incrementally, each one explained away as a temporary adjustment or a strategic reallocation of resources. They had accepted these explanations because the alternative that Germany's industrial capacity was being stretched to its limits was unthinkable. They had believed because believing was easier than doubting, and because in those early years, doubt had seemed like a betrayal of everything they were working to achieve. Now, doubt was the only honest response to what they had discovered. The changes had crept in so gradually that Klaus couldn't identify a single moment when everything had shifted. Instead, it had been a slow accumulation of small compromises, each one rationalized, each one accepted as temporary. He remembered the first time in late 1942 when a shipment of cylinder heads had arrived with visible flaws, minor casting imperfections that would have been rejected outright just a year earlier. The accompanying directive had been clear: use them anyway. The alternative was grounding aircraft for lack of parts. Klaus and Werner had spent extra hours inspecting each head, trying to determine which ones were safe to install and which ones might fail under stress. It had been an agonizing process, knowing that their judgment might mean the difference between a pilot returning safely or dying in a catastrophic engine failure. Werner had noticed the change in the pilots first. The experienced aces who had flown since the beginning of the war were gradually disappearing, some killed in action, others transferred to training commands where their experience was desperately needed to prepare the next generation. Their replacements were younger, often with less than 100 hours of flight time. Klaus remembered a boy. He could only think of him as a boy who looked no older than 19, asking nervous questions about engine performance as Klaus performed a pre-flight inspection. 2 days later, that same young pilot had failed to return from a mission over France. His aircraft had been shot down by American P-38 fighters. The squadron leader had told Klaus that the boy had panicked during the engagement, making tactical errors that a more experienced pilot never would have made. The Allied bombing raids had intensified throughout 1943, and the facility itself had become a target. Klaus and Werner had grown accustomed to working in bomb-damaged buildings, to repairing aircraft in workshops where winter wind whistled through holes in the roof that couldn't be properly fixed because construction materials were needed elsewhere. They had learned to ignore the sound of air raid sirens, to calculate whether they had time to finish a critical repair before taking shelter, to accept that every day might be their last. The constant stress had worn on everyone. Tempers grew shorter, mistakes became more frequent, and the easy camaraderie of the early years had been replaced by grim determination. The material shortages had become impossible to ignore by 1944. Aluminum was increasingly diverted to other uses, forcing manufacturers to use substitute alloys that were heavier and less reliable. High-grade steel for bearings and gears was scarce, replaced by inferior metals that wore out faster and required more frequent replacement. Even basic supplies like proper cleaning solvents and lubricants had become difficult to obtain. Klaus and Werner had developed workarounds for dozens of problems, learning to make do with whatever materials they could scavenge or improvise. They had become experts at keeping aircraft flying through ingenuity and sheer determination. They had told themselves that this was what German resourcefulness looked like, that their ability to overcome these challenges proved their superiority. Now, looking at the American engine with its abundance of premium materials and its evidence of unlimited industrial capacity, they understood that resourcefulness born of desperation was not the same as strength. On the fourth day of their examination, Klaus and Werner began documenting their findings in a detailed technical report that Major Kessler had requested. As Klaus wrote, translating their observations into clinical technical language, the full scope of American industrial superiority became impossible to deny. The P-47's engine wasn't just well made, it was a masterpiece of mass production engineering. Every component they examined revealed design choices that prioritized manufacturability without sacrificing performance. The Americans had solved problems that German engineers were still struggling with, and they had done so in ways that allowed for rapid, consistent production. Werner had spent hours examining the supercharger assembly, and his findings were particularly disturbing. The turbine blades were precision cast, each one identical to the next, with surface finishes that indicated advanced metallurgical processes. "Look at this," Werner said, holding up one of the blades for Klaus to examine under magnification. "The grain structure is uniform throughout. No weak points, no inclusions. This is high-quality nickel alloy, probably with chromium and other additives we can barely obtain anymore." He set the blade down carefully. "And they're making thousands of these, thousands of complete engines. This isn't a prototype or a limited production run. This is standard equipment." Klaus pulled out a worn notebook where he had been keeping calculations. The numbers were devastating. Based on intelligence reports they had access to and the evidence before them, he estimated that American factories were producing at least 10 P-47 aircraft per day, probably more. Each one powered by an engine that represented a level of industrial sophistication that Germany could not match. And the P-47 was just one of many American aircraft types. There were the B-17 and B-24 bombers, the P-38 and P-51 fighters, transport aircraft, training aircraft, all being produced in quantities that Klaus's calculations suggested were almost beyond comprehension. He showed his notebook to Werner, pointing to the final figure. "If these estimates are even remotely accurate, the Americans are building more aircraft in 1 month than we can build in 6, maybe in a year." Werner stared at the numbers, his face pale. "And that's just aircraft. What about tanks, ships, artillery? If they're applying the same industrial methods to everything else, then the material advantage isn't just significant, it's insurmountable." Klaus nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that realization settle into his bones. Germany was fighting with craftsmanship and courage against an enemy with unlimited resources and industrial capacity that existed on a scale German planners had apparently never imagined. The evidence was there in every component of the engine before them. In the abundance of high-quality materials, in the precision of the manufacturing, in the standardization that allowed for rapid production and easy maintenance, in the engineering solutions that were elegant and practical rather than brilliant but complex. The Americans had built an industrial machine designed for one purpose: to overwhelm their enemies not through tactical superiority or individual heroism, but through sheer unstoppable volume of production. And they were succeeding. Klaus closed his notebook and looked at Werner. "We need to finish this report for Major Kessler," he said quietly. "He needs to see these numbers." Major Friedrich Kessler arrived at the workshop early the next morning, earlier than Klaus and Werner had expected. He was a career officer in his mid-40s, a man who had served in the Great War as a young enlisted mechanic and had risen through the ranks based on competence rather than political connections. Klaus had always respected him for that. Kessler was one of the few officers who understood the technical realities of their work and didn't waste time with empty propaganda slogans. But as the major entered the workshop and closed the door behind him with deliberate care, Klaus saw something in his face that he hadn't seen before: fear. "Show me everything," Kessler said without preamble. For the next hour, Klaus and Werner walked him through their findings, pointing out each detail, each revelation, each piece of evidence that pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. The major listened in silence, occasionally picking up a component to examine it himself, his expression growing more grave with each passing minute. When they finished, he stood at the workbench for a long moment, his hands resting on the disassembled engine as though drawing strength or perhaps saying farewell to something he had once believed in. "I had hoped I was wrong," Kessler finally said, his voice so quiet that Klaus had to lean closer to hear him. "I've been seeing reports from other facilities, other captured equipment, British radar systems that are more sophisticated than ours, American trucks that run for thousands of kilometers without major repairs while our vehicles break down constantly, Soviet tanks being produced in quantities that shouldn't be possible for a nation we were told was primitive and backward." He looked up at Klaus and Werner, and in his eyes was the same devastation they had felt when they first understood what the engine represented. But I kept telling myself that these were isolated cases, that our leadership knew things we didn't, that there was some larger strategy that would turn everything around. Werner glanced at the door nervously before speaking. "Major, what you're saying," Kessler cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I know exactly what I'm saying, and I know the consequences if the wrong person hears it. That's why we're having this conversation here, now, with just the three of us." He pulled up a stool and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. "Gentlemen, I'm going to speak plainly, and then we're going to decide together what we do with this knowledge. Germany cannot win this war. Perhaps we never could have won it once America entered. The industrial disparity is too great, the resource advantage too overwhelming. Every day we continue fighting is simply adding to a casualty list that will end the same way regardless." Klaus felt his heart pounding. To hear these words from a superior officer, spoken aloud in clear German rather than whispered in the dark, was both terrifying and oddly liberating. "What can we do?" he asked. Kessler looked at him with eyes full of a sorrow that went deeper than personal grief. "That," he said, "is the question that will define whether we're remembered as men who had the courage to face the truth or as cowards who knew better but did nothing." The news arrived 3 days later in the form of a telegram, delivered to Werner's hand by a young corporal whose face bore the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered too many such messages. Werner read it standing in the middle of the workshop, his hands beginning to shake before he had finished the first line. Klaus watched his friend's face drain of color, saw the paper flutter slightly as Werner's grip weakened. "It's Martin," Werner said, his voice hollow. "My nephew, shot down over France 5 days ago. No survivors." Klaus remembered Martin Steiger. He had been 20 years old, a cheerful kid who had earned his wings only 4 months earlier. He had visited the workshop twice, eager to meet the uncle he had heard so much about, excited to talk about flying with men who understood aircraft. Werner had introduced him to Klaus with obvious pride, and Klaus had spent an afternoon showing the young pilot around the facility, explaining how they maintained the engines, answering his technical questions with the patience of a craftsman passing knowledge to the next generation. Martin had been fascinated by everything, asking intelligent questions, listening carefully to their advice about how to recognize engine problems before they became critical failures. Now Martin was dead, shot out of the sky by American fighters that were probably powered by engines just like the one sitting on their workbench. Klaus watched Werner fold the telegram carefully and place it in his pocket, watched his friend's jaw clench as he fought to maintain composure. "He wrote to me last week," Werner said after a long silence. "He was excited, said he had shot down 2 enemy fighters and was finally feeling confident in combat. He asked me to send him one of grandmother's recipes because the food at his base was terrible and he wanted to remember what home tasted like." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Klaus felt the weight of their knowledge pressing down on him with renewed force. They had spent days examining the engine that represented American industrial might, calculating production numbers, understanding the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat. But those had been abstractions, numbers on paper, technical assessments. Martin's death was concrete and personal. A young man who had trusted in his training, his aircraft, and his country's propaganda about inevitable victory was now gone. Another name added to a list that grew longer every day. Werner walked to the workbench and placed his hand on the American engine, his fingers tracing the cooling fins of one cylinder. "We maintained the engine in his aircraft," he said quietly. "Last month, remember? The Messerschmitt with the overheating problem. We spent 2 full days getting it running properly again. We did good work, perfect work." His voice cracked slightly. And then we sent him back up to die in a war that we now know we cannot win." Klaus had no words of comfort to offer because there was no comfort to be found. They were good mechanics who had done their jobs with skill and dedication, and in prize, doing so, they had helped prolong a war that was consuming young men like Martin for no purpose except to delay the inevitable. That night, the three men met again in the workshop after the rest of the facility had gone to sleep. Major Kessler had brought a bottle of real French cognac, liberated from some forgotten storage room, and they passed it between them without bothering with glasses. The alcohol burned less than the questions they were wrestling with, questions that had no good answers but demanded to be confronted nonetheless. Klaus spoke first, giving voice to the thought that had been haunting him since Werner received news of Martin's death. Every aircraft we repair and send back into service is another chance for someone's son or nephew or brother to die. We're enabling this. We're part of the machinery that's grinding up lives for a cause that's already lost. Kessler took a long drink before responding. And if we stop? If we sabotage our own work? If we refuse to maintain the aircraft? The Gestapo would have us arrested within days. We'd be executed as traitors, and 3 new mechanics would take our places and continue the work we refuse to do. Nothing would change except that we'd be dead. Werner leaned against the workbench, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. So we have no choice? We just keep doing this, keep sending men up to die, because the alternative is our own execution? That's not morality. That's cowardice dressed up as pragmatism. The accusation hung in the air, and none of them could honestly deny it. Klaus had spent hours turning the problem over in his mind, looking for a solution that didn't exist. If they openly refused to work, they would be killed and replaced. If they sabotaged aircraft, obviously, the same fate awaited them. If they did nothing and continued as they had been, they were complicit in prolonging a war that was costing lives for no purpose. Every option led to death, either their own or the pilots they served. "What if?" Klaus said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "What if we made small changes? Not obvious sabotage, nothing that would cause crashes or be easily detected, but adjustments that would reduce performance slightly. Engines that run a bit less efficiently, consume more fuel, produce slightly less power. Nothing that would kill a pilot, but enough to maybe shorten missions, reduce combat effectiveness, make it harder for the Luftwaffe to operate." Kessler looked at him sharply. "You're talking about deliberate degradation of military equipment during wartime. You understand what that is?" Klaus met his eyes steadily. "I understand that every day this war continues, more people die. German pilots, Allied airmen, civilians in bombed cities. If we could shorten the war by even a few weeks through our actions, how many lives would that save? Isn't that a more moral choice than maintaining perfect engines that enable more death?" Werner straightened, his expression thoughtful despite his grief. "It would have to be subtle. Adjustments that could be explained as normal variation or minor errors. Things that wouldn't show up in standard inspections." Kessler was quiet for a long time, wrestling with a decision that could cost him everything he had built over a career spanning 2 wars. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "If we do this, we do it carefully, and we accept that we're gambling with our lives for a chance to save others." The changes they made were subtle enough that Klaus sometimes wondered if they were making any difference at all. A fuel mixture adjusted to run slightly rich, wasting precious gasoline and reducing range. Timing settings altered by fractions of a degree, diminishing engine power by amounts that wouldn't be immediately noticeable but would accumulate over the course of a mission. Control cables tensioned just slightly off specification, making aircraft marginally less responsive. Each adjustment was small enough to be attributed to normal variation or minor human error, but together they represented a deliberate choice to undermine the war effort they had once served with such dedication. Werner proved to have a gift for this careful sabotage. His decades of experience meant he understood exactly where the tolerances were, how far he could push specifications before anyone would notice. He showed Klaus how to file down a gear tooth by barely perceptible amounts, creating wear patterns that would cause premature failure weeks or months later rather than immediately. How to introduce tiny imperfections in fuel lines that would cause pressure drops too small to trigger alarms, but large enough to affect performance. how to reassemble components with almost imperceptible misalignments that would compound into significant problems over time. Major Kessler provided cover for their activities, carefully managing which aircraft came to Klaus and Werner for maintenance and which went to other mechanics in the facility. He falsified inspection reports when necessary, attributing performance problems to combat damage or normal wear rather than maintenance issues. The three of them worked in careful coordination, always maintaining plausible deniability, always able to explain away any single incident as an honest mistake or unavoidable consequence of material shortages. But the moral weight of what they were doing grew heavier with each passing day. Klaus would watch pilots pre-flight aircraft he had just maintained, knowing that he had deliberately degraded the machine they were trusting with their lives. He told himself that reduced performance was better than death, that a pilot who returned early due to fuel concerns was a pilot who survived. But he couldn't escape the possibility that his sabotage might contribute to someone's death in ways he couldn't predict. A fighter that was 5% less powerful might lose a critical dogfight. An aircraft with slightly worse fuel economy might not make it home, forcing the pilot to bail out over enemy territory. Werner struggled with the same doubts, especially after Martin's death. "Are we saving lives or just changing which lives are lost?" he asked one night as they worked late in the empty workshop. Klaus had no answer. They were navigating moral terrain without maps, making choices based on incomplete information and uncertain consequences. All they knew for certain was that doing nothing, continuing to maintain aircraft with perfect precision, felt like a greater betrayal of their conscience than taking these calculated risks. For 3 months, they continued their subtle campaign of resistance. Aircraft left their workshop performing below specifications in ways that were difficult to detect and easy to rationalize. Missions were shortened, combat effectiveness was reduced, and the Luftwaffe's already desperate situation became fractionally more desperate. And then, in January of 1945, everything fell apart. His name was Otto Brecht, and he was 23 years old with the kind of fervent loyalty to the Nazi Party that only youth and ignorance could sustain. He had been assigned to the facility in December, a newly trained mechanic with more ideological enthusiasm than practical skill. Klaus had noticed him immediately, the way he reported for duty with a crisp Hitler salute, the way he wore his party pin prominently even when it wasn't required, the way he watched other workers with suspicious eyes as if constantly searching for signs of defeatism or disloyalty. Werner had warned Klaus to be careful around him, but they had assumed that as long as they maintained their usual professional demeanor, young Brecht would have nothing to report. They had underestimated his combination of inexperience and zealotry. Brecht had been assigned to assist Klaus on a routine maintenance job, and Klaus had made adjustments to the fuel system with the practiced ease of months of subtle sabotage. But Brecht, lacking the experience to understand the acceptable margins of variation, had noticed something was wrong. He had said nothing at the time, but Klaus saw him making notes in a small book he kept in his breast pocket. 2 days later, Brecht had requested permission to inspect some of Klaus's recent work. Klaus had no grounds to refuse without arousing suspicion. The young mechanic had been thorough, checking every adjustment Klaus had made against the official specifications. He found discrepancies, small ones, each individually explainable as minor error, but together forming a pattern. Brecht had then, without authorization, inspected aircraft that Werner had recently maintained and found similar patterns. That evening, Klaus saw Brecht leaving the facility commander's office, and he knew with sickening certainty that their careful resistance had been exposed. The Gestapo came the next morning. 2 men in long leather coats who arrived in a black Mercedes and asked for Klaus Hoffmann and Werner Steiger by name. Major Kessler tried to intervene, demanded to know the charges, insisted on his right to handle discipline within his own command. But the Gestapo agents weren't interested in military protocol. They had evidence of sabotage, they said. They had documentation of systematic degradation of military equipment. They had testimony from a loyal German worker who had noticed irregularities and done his patriotic duty by reporting them. Klaus and Werner were given 10 minutes to collect their personal belongings before being handcuffed and placed in the back of the Mercedes. As they were led out of the workshop, Klaus saw Otto Brecht watching from a distance, his young face radiating self-righteous satisfaction. The boy genuinely believed he had served his country well, had protected the Reich from traitors undermining the war effort. He had no idea that the war was already lost, that his loyalty was to a cause that had been doomed from the moment the P-47 engine had revealed the truth about American industrial might. The drive to Gestapo headquarters in Berlin took 2 hours. Neither Klaus nor Werner spoke during the journey. There was nothing left to say. They had made their choice, had taken their stand against a war they knew was unwinnable, and now they would face the consequences of that choice. The interrogation had been brutal but brief. The Gestapo already had the evidence they needed from Otto Brecht's meticulous documentation. What they wanted was names: who else was involved, who had ordered the sabotage, what larger conspiracy existed. Klaus and Werner had given them nothing. Not because they were particularly brave, but because protecting Major Kessler was the only meaningful thing they could still do. After 3 days of questioning that left both men bruised and exhausted, a different verdict came down than the one they had expected. Instead of execution for treason, they were sentenced to a military work camp. The regime, desperate for skilled labor as the war situation deteriorated, had apparently decided that dead mechanics were less useful than imprisoned ones. Stalag Luft 7 was located in eastern Germany, and by the time Klaus and Werner arrived in February of 1945, it held a strange mixture of prisoners. There were German soldiers convicted of various offenses: desertion, insubordination, black market activities. And there were Allied airmen, primarily American and British bomber crews shot down over German territory. The camp was overcrowded, undersupplied, and run by guards who were either too old or too injured for frontline service. Klaus and Werner were put to work in the camp's maintenance shop, repairing everything from guard tower lighting to the camp commander's staff car. It was menial work, a humiliating assignment for men who had once maintained the Luftwaffe's finest aircraft. But they were alive. And in the winter of 1945 in Nazi Germany, being alive was something to be grateful for. The interaction with Allied prisoners began cautiously. The camp's rules technically forbade fraternization, but the guards were increasingly apathetic as news from the fronts grew worse. An American pilot named Lieutenant Robert Fletcher was the first to approach Klaus in the workshop. He had noticed Klaus examining a damaged generator and recognized the careful movements of a skilled mechanic. "You know engines?" Fletcher asked in broken German. Klaus nodded, and over the next hour, they worked together to repair the generator, communicating through a mixture of German, English, and hand gestures. It was Fletcher who first confirmed what Klaus and Werner had concluded months earlier. When Klaus carefully broached the subject of American industrial production, Fletcher laughed not with mockery, but with the rueful amusement of someone stating the obvious. "We're building hundreds of planes every week," he said. "Thousands, probably. Back home, they converted car factories to build bombers. I watched B-24s rolling off assembly lines in Detroit faster than we could train crews to fly them." He looked at Klaus with something like sympathy. "Your propaganda told you we were weak, didn't it? That we couldn't sustain a war?" Klaus nodded slowly. "We believed it," he said quietly, "until we examined one of your engines and realized we had been lied to about everything." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then extended his hand. "You're the first German I've met who admitted that." Klaus shook his hand, and in that simple gesture felt something shift. They were no longer enemies. They were just men caught in the machinery of a war neither of them had wanted, trying to survive until it was finally over, May 7, 1945. The sound of American artillery had been growing closer for 3 days, and the camp guards had begun abandoning their posts in small groups, slipping away in stolen civilian clothes to avoid capture. The remaining prisoners, German and Allied alike, waited in tense anticipation for what everyone knew was inevitable. Klaus and Werner stood in the workshop they had occupied for the past 3 months, listening to the distant rumble of tanks and the occasional crack of rifle fire. Lieutenant Fletcher joined them, along with several other Allied airmen who had become friends over the long winter months. "Should be any time now," Fletcher said, his voice tight with excitement and nervousness. The American forces arrived just after dawn the next morning. Soldiers from the 3rd Armored Division rolled through the camp gates in Sherman tanks and half-tracks, and Klaus watched as men who had been prisoners for years rushed forward with tears streaming down their faces. The liberation was chaotic but largely peaceful. The few remaining German guards surrendered without resistance, and the American commander quickly established order. Klaus and Werner remained in the workshop, uncertain of their status. They were German prisoners in a camp being liberated by Americans, neither quite enemy combatants nor political prisoners deserving of sympathy. It was Fletcher who advocated for them. He found the American captain in charge and explained who Klaus and Werner were, what they had discovered about the P-47 engine, and why they had ended up in the camp. The captain listened with growing interest, then asked to speak with Klaus directly. For the next 2 hours, Klaus recounted the entire story, the examination of the captured engine, the calculations about American production capacity, the agonizing decision to engage in subtle sabotage, and the eventual arrest that had saved them from execution only by accident of timing. The captain took detailed notes and asked technical questions that revealed his own engineering background. "You're telling me you figured out we were going to win the war just by examining one engine?" he asked. Klaus nodded. "The engine told us everything we needed to know about American industrial capacity. After that, it was just mathematics." The captain arranged for Klaus and Werner to be processed as civilian detainees rather than prisoners of war. Their technical expertise and their documented resistance to the Nazi war effort, however small, earned them preferential treatment. By June, they were both employed by the American Occupation Authority, helping to assess and catalog German aviation technology and facilities. Their story had spread through intelligence channels, becoming a footnote in the larger narrative of Germany's defeat, a small example of how even loyal Germans had eventually recognized the mathematical certainty of their country's doom. Years later, Klaus would lecture at technical colleges about the industrial factors that had determined the war's outcome. He always began with the story of the P-47 engine sitting on a workshop table, and how examining that single machine had revealed truths that propaganda could not conceal. Sometimes, he would tell his students, the most important discoveries are the ones that destroy everything you believed. The question is whether you have the courage to accept what the evidence tells you, even when the truth is devastating.